The morning after their quiet engagement ceremony dawned softer than usual, as if the garden itself wanted to grant them one more day of unbroken peace. Golden sunlight filtered through the dense bamboo leaves, casting delicate moving patterns across the wooden porch where Tieu Lac stood with a steaming cup of ginger tea in her hands. The air smelled of fresh dew, young bamboo shoots, and the faint sweetness of night-blooming jasmine that still lingered from the previous evening. The gourd vines on the repaired trellis swayed gently in the light breeze, their heavy green fruits hanging like promises of a bountiful harvest. Tieu Lac wore a simple pale yellow cotton dress that brushed against her bare calves. Her hair was loosely tied back, a few strands escaping to frame her face. The engagement ring on her left hand caught the morning light, sending tiny sparks dancing across the wooden floorboards. She watched as Quan moved around the garden with quiet purpose, his tall frame bent slightly as he checked the soil near the vegetable beds. He had rolled up the sleeves of his white shirt again, the strong lines of his forearms visible in the sunlight. Even in these peaceful moments, there was something undeniably protective in the way he carried himself. She smiled softly, remembering the way he had held her last night on these very steps, his forehead against hers, his voice thick with emotion as he vowed to keep her safe. But beneath that warmth, she could still feel the shadow of the phone call he had received during their celebration. Mr. Vin. The name echoed faintly in her mind like a distant warning bell. Quan straightened up and caught her gaze. His expression softened immediately, the sharp edges of the CEO melting away as he walked toward her. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at her with that familiar mix of tenderness and quiet intensity. "Morning," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. He climbed the steps and leaned down to press a gentle kiss to her forehead, his hand coming up to cup the back of her neck. "You slept well?" Tieu Lac nodded, setting her tea aside so she could wrap her arms around his waist. "Better than I expected, considering everything." She rested her cheek against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "The garden looks beautiful today. The gourds are growing so fast now." Quan hummed in agreement, his arms tightening around her. For a moment, they simply stood there, wrapped in the quiet morning. The children from the village would arrive soon for their usual lessons and playtime. Their laughter would fill the air, and for a while, the world would feel safe again. But peace, she was learning, was never truly permanent. It was mid-morning when Quan's phone vibrated on the wooden table, where they had set up a simple breakfast of sticky rice cakes and fresh fruit. He glanced at the screen, and Tieu Lac noticed the subtle change in his posture, the slight stiffening of his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened for just a fraction of a second. He excused himself with a soft squeeze of her hand and walked toward the far end of the porch, out of easy earshot. Tieu Lac busied herself clearing the dishes, but her eyes kept drifting toward him. She couldn't hear the words clearly, but she could read the tension in his body language. When he finally ended the call and turned back to her, his face was carefully composed, though the warmth in his eyes had dimmed slightly. "Bad news?" she asked quietly as he returned to her side. Quan hesitated, then pulled out a chair and sat down, gesturing for her to join him. He took both of her hands in his larger ones, his thumbs tracing those familiar slow circles on her skin. "My assistant in the city sent an update," he said carefully, his voice low. "Mr. Vin has resurfaced. He's been quietly buying up small plots of land on the outskirts of this province, land that borders some of the highland villages, including areas not far from here. It's not confirmed yet, but there are signs he's hired local men for odd jobs, surveillance, maybe more." Tieu Lac's breath caught. The peaceful garden suddenly felt smaller, the bamboo grove less like a protective wall and more like a place where shadows could hide. She squeezed his hands tighter. "He's coming for you," she whispered. Quan shook his head slowly. "Not directly for me, for what matters to me now." His dark eyes met hers with raw honesty. "For you, for this life we're building. He knows I left the city, that I've been staying here. If he can't touch my company anymore, he'll try to destroy the one thing I care about more than anything. The fear that washed through her was sharp, but it didn't overwhelm her like it once might have. Instead, it mixed with a fierce determination. This garden, this house, the children who ran barefoot through the vines, they had healed her. They had healed Quan too. She refused to let someone from his past take that away. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Quan exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck, a gesture she had come to recognize as him trying to carry the weight alone. "I think we should go back to the city for a while," he said quietly, "just until things are under control. My penthouse is secure. I can have a full team watching the perimeter here if needed, but I won't risk you being exposed." Or, he paused, his gaze darkening. "I can handle Vin the old way, use my connections, make sure he understands that coming after us will cost him everything he has left." Tieu Lac pulled her hands back gently, though she kept her eyes on his. The suggestion hit her like a cold wind through the bamboo. "Leave?" she repeated, the word tasting bitter. "You want us to leave the garden? The house? The children?" Quan reached for her again, but she stood up, walking a few steps toward the railing of the porch. Below them, the gourd trellis stood tall and proud, the vines they had nurtured together climbing confidently. The wooden tables from yesterday's celebration were still there, scattered with a few forgotten flower petals. "This place saved me, Quan," she said, turning back to face him. Her voice was soft but carried an undercurrent of steel. "When I ran here after men, I was broken, empty. This garden taught me how to grow again. The children, they look up to us now. If we leave, even temporarily, what message does that send? That fear wins? That we let someone like Vin chase us out of our home?" Quan stood as well, his tall frame casting a shadow across the wooden floor. "It's not about fear winning. It's about keeping you safe. I've seen what men like Vin are capable of. He lost everything because of me once. He won't hesitate to hurt you to get to me. And running away is your solution?" Tieu Lac's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but they were not tears of weakness. They were born of deep love and frustration. "You told me you wanted a real life here. Slow mornings, fixing trellises, dancing in the rain. Was that just words? Or do you still believe the only way to be strong is to go back to being the cold CEO who solves everything with power and distance?" The words hung between them, heavier than the humid morning air. Quan flinched visibly, pain flashing across his features. "I'm trying to protect what we have," he said, his voice rougher now. "I'm terrified of losing you, Tieu Lac. If something happens to you because of my past, then we face it together," she interrupted gently but firmly, stepping closer until she could place her palms on his chest. She could feel his heart racing beneath her fingers. "That's what we promised last night. Not that you would shield me from everything, but that we would stand side by side. I'm not fragile glass, Quan. I survived Min. I survived running away and rebuilding my life here. I can survive this too, but only if you don't shut me out and turn back into the man who thought he had to carry the world alone." Quan's hands came up to cover hers, his grip tight as if afraid she might slip away. The conflict in his eyes was raw, love warring with fear, the desire for peace clashing with the instincts of a man who had built an empire through control. They stood like that for a long moment, the garden breathing quietly around them. Somewhere in the distance, the laughter of approaching village children drifted through the bamboo. Life, ordinary and precious, continued. Finally, Quan pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I don't want to become that man again. But the thought of you getting hurt—" "I know," she whispered, hugging him back just as tightly. "But pushing me away to protect me, that hurts too." The rest of the morning passed in a careful balance. They welcomed the children, helped them with simple lessons under the shade of the gourd trellis, and laughed when the little ones tried to braid flowers into Quan's hair again. Yet beneath the surface, the tension lingered. Tieu Lac could see it in the way Quan's gaze occasionally scanned the edge of the bamboo grove, in the way his hand would instinctively find hers more often than usual. By afternoon, the sky had turned a soft gray, threatening a light rain. They retreated inside the wooden house to prepare lunch together, a small act of normalcy. Tieu Lac chopped fresh herbs while Quan stirred a pot of fragrant fish soup. The kitchen filled with the comforting smells of garlic, ginger, and lemongrass. For a while, the simple rhythm of cooking eased the strain between them. As they ate at the small wooden table by the window, rain began to patter softly against the roof. Quan reached across the table and took her hand again. "I don't want to fight with you," he said quietly. "Not about this." Tieu Lac smiled faintly, her thumb brushing over his knuckles. "Then don't make decisions for both of us. Let's decide together." Quan nodded slowly, though the worry in his eyes hadn't fully disappeared. "Tonight," he promised, "after the children leave, we'll talk properly. All night if we need to." She squeezed his hand. "Good. Because I'm not running anymore, Quan. And I won't let you run either." Outside, the rain grew steadier, washing over the garden like a gentle cleansing. The gourd vines glistened under the downpour, strong and resilient. Inside the warm wooden house, two hearts sat across from each other, caught between fear and love, between the pull of the past and the fragile, beautiful future they were trying to build. The storm outside was mild, the one brewing between them and the one approaching from the shadows of Quan's past felt far more significant. The afternoon rain continued in a steady, soothing rhythm, turning the garden into a watercolor painting of soft greens and shimmering silver. Water dripped from the edges of the thatched roof and ran in tiny rivers along the bamboo poles supporting the gourd trellis. Inside the wooden house, the air was warm and fragrant with the remnants of their simple lunch and the faint scent of wet earth drifting through the open windows. Tieu Lac and Quan spent the rest of the day in careful domestic harmony. The village children had been sent home early because of the rain, their excited voices fading down the muddy path. Now it was just the two of them, moving around the house in quiet tandem. Quan repaired a loose board on the porch steps while Tieu Lac cleaned the kitchen and prepared ingredients for dinner. Every so often, their eyes would meet across the room, carrying unspoken words and the lingering weight of their earlier conversation. As evening approached, the rain eased into a gentle drizzle. Quan suggested they cook together again, a larger meal this time, something comforting and time-consuming that would give them space to talk without the pressure of facing each other directly at first. Tieu Lac agreed. They worked side by side at the wooden counter, Quan filleting fresh fish with careful, precise movements, while Tieu Lac pounded lemongrass and garlic in a stone mortar. The rhythmic sound of the pestle filled the kitchen, grounding them both. "You were right this morning," Quan said after a long silence, his voice low and steady as he sliced ginger into thin strips. "I was trying to protect you the only way I knew how, by taking control, by removing you from danger. But that's the old me, the one who thought distance and power were the only answers." Tieu Lac glanced at him, her hands pausing over the herbs. "And what's the new you, Quan?" He set the knife down and turned to face her fully, wiping his hands on a clean cloth. The sleeves of his shirt were rolled up, revealing the strong forearms she had come to love. Rain light from the window softened the sharp lines of his face. "The new me wants to stay," he said simply. "Here, with you, fixing broken steps, teaching kids how to tie vines, waking up to the smell of ginger tea and your hair on my pillow. But the fear, it's real, Tieu Lac. Vin isn't just some business rival anymore. My assistant confirmed he's been in contact with a few disgruntled locals. He's offering money for information about us, about the house, our routines, even the children who come here." Tieu Lac's heart tightened, but she refused to let fear dictate her response. She stepped closer, placing her hand on his chest, feeling the steady beat beneath her palm. "Then we don't run," she said firmly. "We protect what's ours. Together. I'm not asking you to ignore the danger. I'm asking you not to let it steal the life we've started building. This garden healed us both. If we leave now, even for a little while, we might never find our way back to this version of ourselves." Quan covered her hand with his thumb tracing slow circles, their silent language of comfort. "I'm terrified of becoming the man who puts you in harm's way because of my pride. But I'm even more scared of becoming the man who pushes you away to keep you safe." They stood like that for a moment, the sound of rain on the roof wrapping around them like a cocoon. Then Tieu Lac smiled softly and tugged him toward the stove. "Come on, let's finish cooking. We can talk more while we eat." Dinner was simple but heartfelt. Steamed fish with ginger and scallions, stir-fried bamboo shoots with fresh herbs, pickled vegetables, and warm rice. They ate at the small table by the window, the lantern light casting a golden glow over their faces. Outside, the drizzle had turned the garden into a misty dreamscape, the gourd vines glistening under the faint moonlight breaking through the clouds. As the meal progressed, the conversation deepened. Quan told her more about the land deal 3 years ago. The bribes, the forged documents, the families Mr. Vin had tried to displace. He spoke of the threats that followed, the slashed tires, the anonymous notes. For the first time, he didn't filter the ugliness. He let her see the full weight he had carried alone. Tieu Lac listened without interruption, her eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she reached across the table and took both his hands. "I'm glad you told me everything," she whispered. "But Quan, you don't have to carry it alone anymore. I ran here once because someone tried to mold me into something I wasn't. I won't let your past do the same to us. We face it side by side." Quan's eyes glistened in the lantern light. He brought her hands to his lips, pressing a lingering kiss to her knuckles. "You make me want to be braver," he murmured. "Not the kind of brave that fights with money and power, but the kind that stays and builds something real." After dinner, they moved to the wide wooden steps of the porch. The rain had stopped completely, leaving the night air cool and fresh, scented with damp soil and night-blooming jasmine. A few lanterns still glowed softly among the gourd vines, casting warm pools of light across the garden. They sat close together, shoulders touching, Quan's arm wrapped around her waist, while Tieu Lac leaned her head against his shoulder. The conversation continued deep into the night. They talked about possibilities, not running to the city, but strengthening their defenses here. Quan suggested quietly increasing security without alarming the village. He mentioned reaching out to a few trusted contacts in the province who could monitor Mr. Vin's movements from afar. Tieu Lac proposed involving a couple of reliable village elders, people who knew the land and its hidden paths better than any outsider. They could watch for strangers without making it obvious. "We don't hide," Tieu Lac said softly, her fingers intertwined with his. "We live. We keep teaching the children, keep tending the garden, keep dancing in the rain when it comes. But we stay alert, together." Quan nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. "I won't make decisions for both of us again. We decide as a team." A comfortable silence settled between them. The bamboo grove whispered gently in the night breeze. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called softly. Tieu Lac shifted until she was straddling his lap on the wide step, her hands framing his face. Their foreheads touched. "Remember what you said to me when you proposed?" she whispered. "You chose me for every quiet morning, every storm we may face, every laugh with the children. I'm choosing the same. Whatever comes, shadows in the forest or storms from your past, we face them here, in the place that made us whole." Quan's arms wrapped around her, pulling her flush against his chest. His hands moved slowly up and down her back in long, reverent strokes. "You have no idea how much you've changed me, Tieu Lac. I thought peace was something I had to earn through success. You showed me it grows in soil and sunlight, in the sound of your laughter. They stayed like that for a long time, exchanging soft kisses that tasted of ginger tea, rain, and quiet promises. The kisses deepened gradually, filled with tenderness and the fierce need to anchor themselves to each other. Quan's fingers threaded through her hair as he kissed her slowly, deeply, pouring every unspoken fear and every overwhelming love into the moment. When they finally drew apart, both breathing a little harder, Quan rested his forehead against hers once more. "I'll keep my old connections on standby," he said quietly, "but only as a last resort. No more going back to the cold CEO, not unless we have no choice." Tieu Lac smiled through the tears that had slipped down her cheeks. Tears of relief, of love, of shared strength. "And I'll remind you every day why this garden is worth fighting for." They stood together and walked inside the house, hand in hand. In the bedroom, under the soft glow of a single lantern, they undressed each other with unhurried care. There was no rush tonight, only the deep need to reaffirm their bond. Quan's touches were gentle yet possessive, his lips tracing the curve of her neck, her shoulders, the places he had come to know so well. Tieu Lac responded with equal tenderness, her hands exploring the strong lines of his back and arms, whispering his name like a prayer. They made love slowly, reverently, bodies moving together in perfect rhythm while the night breeze drifted through the open window, carrying the scent of the garden they had chosen to protect. Every touch spoke of commitment. Every kiss sealed their promise to face whatever lay ahead, side by side. Afterward, they lay tangled in the simple cotton sheets, Quan's arm wrapped protectively around her waist as Tieu Lac rested her head on his chest. His heartbeat was steady and strong beneath her ear. "No matter what happens," she whispered, echoing the words they had exchanged before, "I'll be here, always." Quan pressed a kiss to the top of her head, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'll be right here with you. We've chosen this life. We'll guard it together." Outside, the garden lay peaceful under the silver moonlight. The gourd trellis stood tall and proud, the vines strong and resilient. The lanterns had dimmed to soft glows, like quiet guardians watching over the wooden house. In the darker reaches of the bamboo grove, the shadows still waited. But tonight, in the warm circle of each other's arms, love felt stronger than any approaching storm. Two hearts had decided to stay, rooted deeply in the soil they had nurtured, ready to face whatever came next. The fragile peace had grown deeper, and they were ready,